Welcome to Sustain What, a series of conversations seeking solutions where complexity and consequence collide. That's basically on just about every sustainability frontier, from shaping a safer relationship with Earth's climate to building more civil online relationships with each other. As we say here in the Communication Initiative of the Columbia Climate School, the word sustainability has no meaning on its own. The first step toward success is to ask, sustain what, how, and for whom? This program contains audio highlights from hundreds of video webcasts, which you can explore on your own at j.mp/sustainwhatlive. I'm Dale Willman, Associate Director of Columbia's Initiative on Communication and Sustainability. The webcast was created and is hosted most of the time by Andy Revkin, the longtime environmental journalist, sometime songwriter, and founding director of the initiative. Read his related dispatches at revkin.bulletin.com. And now, Sustain What?
Good morning, or wherever you are. Good day. This is Andy Revkin. I run a new initiative at Columbia University's Earth Institute on communication and sustainability. And I would say communication for sustainability, but I'm trying to understand the upsides and downsides of how we can make progress in a world where we're sort of suffused in so much stuff, some of which is information, some of which is actionable, but much of which is designed to distract us or confuse us, actually. And so it's up to purveyors of information and audiences to figure out better pathways forward. And this conversation, this Sustain What effort, was launched. I started this mid-March as an experiment centered on COVID-19, when all of us are forced, whether we want to or not, to do a lot more of our communication online. And I think a lot of that's going to actually persist and grow. So this isn't like a temporary patch, and then we all go back to our long commutes and the like. I think there's some good changes going forward. But today's discussion, I'm really honored to have a couple of guests who have already been on this show. I will call it a show, I guess, webcast. Alice Hill, who was a long time, has had a career in national security, including the National Security Council, very strong focus on climate adaptation, climate resilience, disaster resilience, but also earlier than that on biodefense and issues directly related to what we're experiencing right now with the pandemic. And also we have Rod Schoonover, a background in physics and other sciences, who had been for a decade in the national intelligence apparatus, working to illuminate for decision makers what is happening in the world, what could pose big risks, and where do we go. And Rod had a fairly prominent moment a year ago. Was it just a year ago, or is it already like 2 years?
It's less than a year.
Yeah, okay, less than a year.
It feels
Time
a lot
is doing
longer.
weird things.
It was like, I don't know, about 8 months.
Yeah, there was some testimony before a congressional committee that was pending, and he was restricted in the way he would be able to present that testimony, and decided, like that great scene in Albert Finney in the movie Network, was just, I'm sick and tired, I'm not going to take it anymore. That meme has come up lately quite a bit. So Rod remains in sort of a consulting role in at this interface between risk and progress. And it's a challenge, as we've seen right now in spades. So we're going to focus on what I'm calling the page 21 effect, which is a term that grew out of something Rod said on this webcast a couple of weeks ago, when we were talking about how the national security apparatus actually has nailed pandemic risk. And even ABC this week reported that the medical intelligence pandemic tracking unit at the Pentagon had nailed that something really weird was going on in Wuhan. Yet we're stuck with this often in the decision process, getting up toward a president. You end up with that competing with all the other things on the agenda. And Rod, as Rod said, in 2019 or 18, threat assessment, it's kind of like on page 21. And that's this question: can we do better at actualizing, at getting presented with information like this in a way that actually gets us to torque how many hospital beds is enough? where are the respirators, are ventilators, are they in good shape? Can change the way government and the rest of us can function and deal with these big risks. So let's start with Rod.
Yeah.
On this question, I'm gonna let me just scroll here. This is the way for people watching online that can see a little bit the words here. You've said a week or so ago that you described this effect. So could you go at that again? What is the phenomenon? Like, as you're working on a report, as you see it work its way up the chain, what is it that sometimes feels frustrating?
Well, it's I was part of the, and by the way, thanks for having me. But I was part of the intelligence community that was tasked with looking at long-range risk, long-range analysis. And, the entire U.S. government is including the intelligence community, is largely in a reactive crisis management mode. I think it was Stephen Hadley back in the Bush administration who said something to the effect that if all you do is manage crises, all you're going to get is more crises because you're not ever planning or putting into place policies to shape the future. And so, things like climate change, things like large scale outages of critical infrastructure, things like pandemics, who are low probability for a given slice of time, but over enough time are reach quite high probabilities. I don't think we in the national security community, or generally the policy community, don't quite have the strategic versus tactical operations calibrated quite correctly.
And is there a case study, or I'm trying to think of a way to crystallize that difference between, or why it gets muddled?
Well, it's basically, much of our history in the, just given 10, 12 years, we have been surprised. We've encountered strategic surprise, whether it's 9/11, whether it's 2008 financial crisis, whether it's Russia invasion of Crimea, the active measures of 2016, Arab Spring, this pandemic, these, although I put the pandemic in a slightly different category, since we knew something like this would eventually come, we just didn't know when and how extreme. But basically, it's a problem. It's a big problem in how to transform strategic foresight and anticipation into effective policy. And so that worldwide threat assessment that I mentioned last time in 2019, it's got a mix of things that are very short-term risks and a little bit of what you might characterize as strategic risk or long-term risk. And it's some of this is institutional, that's been around for decades, and some of it are maybe new developments. So, yeah,
and Alice, from your perspective too, could you just go back? You said you were you focused on biodefense stuff at a certain point. Could you maybe think about that in this context too?
Sure. Listening to this, any administration is challenged by the fact that the urgent will often overtake the important. So what happens, and I saw this when I was at the Department of Homeland Security as well as at the White House, is that the crisis of the day tended to consume a great deal of energy, and it was hard to step back to do the type of policy planning that would better prepare the nation for risks like a pandemic that can bring the nation to its knees. So it is incumbent upon leadership to said that
I'm still here, Andy. I think Alice
Yeah,
is broken up a
Alice,
bit.
you froze there. Let me see if she maybe she can come back in, and this is another issue. 5G would be a good thing. She'll hopefully come back in. Hold on. Let me just scoot her out. Okay. So, well, that was, she made a very, oh, hold on. Here she's back, I think.
Yeah.
What? Maybe not.
Well, let me just pick up on what she's saying.
Yeah,
it's a restatement of what I'm saying.
Right.
That there she is.
Well, let me just say we had a task force that looked at this, and it's challenging for the government because there's so many agencies that have responsibility for pandemics, for example. And coordinating all of that, there's the question of who's in charge. So for the Department of Homeland Security, it wasn't clear what we were in charge of. There were certain things coordinating with state and locals, which we now know is so important in the case of fighting a pandemic. That was within DHS's lane. But it's difficult without money contributed to exercises, to scenario planning, and then actually deployment of resources, for example, forward positioning of stockpiles for the nation truly to get prepared. And that requires Congress and others being willing to invest in long-term preparedness. We historically have not seen that.
I just wanted you to back up to I think you were frozen for a little while there. So you could you just restate the case how you were involved through? It was Homeland Security.
Sure. Secretary Napolitano asked me to head a biological task force looking at biothreats to the nation. That would include a pandemic. It also included, for example, terrorist attacks using agents such as aerosolized anthrax. So we had an opportunity to look at all of our procedures within the department, and that department really somewhat uniquely in the United States, it's got the Homeland Security focus, but Homeland Security involves preparing with state and local and tribal leaders. So we were looking at how do we deploy, for example, personal protective equipment in advance? How do we get prophylactic drugs out to the American citizens should we have a biological attack? Trying to solve the many logistic problems involved. And I will credit Secretary Napolitano. She recognized that biothreats, H1N1, occurred very early in the Obama administration. She recognized this would be a long-term vulnerability for the United States, and she asked that a task force be set up, asked me to lead it, to make sure that we were coordinating within the department and then with all the other agencies as well as to how to be prepared.
And how much of this, what would be a great case study of where people gamed out a situation and we got it right? And not just in the United States, for example. I don't know if there's a situation that comes to mind where you've seen the process work well. I don't know, Rod or Alice.
Well, I can give an example, but so in 2018, when I was still at the National Intelligence Council, and for a while I was double-hatted as the Environment and Natural Resources Director and also the Global Health Advisor. And this is, I think it was 2018, where we had an analytic simulation of an emergent pandemic in an era of disinformation. That was basically the theme. How does something like a re-emergent or a newly emergent disease evolve as we're being hit with all kinds of disinformation? And so we did that. It was an unclassified or for official use only analytic simulation with multiple agencies involved. And it was chaos. It was absolute, just one mistake made after another from agencies. And so, that doesn't try to game out different policy responses, really to the degree that they needed to. This analytic simulation, called again a war game by others, lasted a couple days, and so and it, by the way, it's just another example of how elements of the Trump administration were they participated in this analytic simulation. But that's one of the really effective ways to do strategic planning, is to do a stress test in simulation environments, not in real-time environments. Right.
I have to agree with that. I think scenario-based planning and actually doing the exercise with deployment of assets to see what the vulnerabilities, that costs a lot of money, but it does reveal where we have cracks. And then, of course, you need to have the political will to close the cracks once they've been identified and move forward. And then you have to do it all over again to see what else may be amiss. And that takes a discipline that may not be present when you have changes of political administrations.
Yeah, so that lack of continuity, because everyone seems to want to jettison whatever the legacy of the last one was. You do see sometimes, like in climate policy, I've seen the Bush era major economies forum became under Obama a major emitters forum or something. But so there can be continuity, and to me that was a perfect example of something that was extra treaty. It was outside the treaty process, but it was going to help enable the treaty. So you can see that continuity. But as you say, I think with national security stuff, I think it's kind of harder. I don't know. Does the Pentagon do this internally sufficiently? They must. If anyone does this right, it would be within the Pentagon.
The Department of Defense does do full-on exercises. They have, I don't even want to guesstimate how much they invest in planning and preparedness, but a great deal. So I would think that all agencies could look to them as a template for what needs to be done. They're testing their plans, creating plans and testing them. I think there's generally a recognition. It was Eisenhower who said, plans during war, plans are useless, but planning is essential. And that really is what is missing, I believe, on a systematic basis in the Homeland Security space. FEMA tries to do that, but it's already stretched with emergency response. So to be able to focus also on the importance of planning is a challenge for them. They try, but they don't have the resources to match the Department of Defense. And then they have the difficult job. Department of Defense plans with itself. Department of Homeland Security has to plan with 50 states and 6 territories and all the lower level governments beyond that, the municipal and tribal and all those entities.
Yeah.
It's really complex.
Well, complex, and I guess when you run that scenario, you realize you have to become comfortable with the fact that the response will be variegated. In other words, part of the strategy at the top must, if you really run that simulation, must essentially embrace the reality that the United States is 50 states with all these different capacities. And even within states, you get like what happened in Florida with different counties getting people off the beaches and others letting the beach parties continue. So I guess that still comes back to the value of running the exercise. And then, but I guess it also gets back to the reality that the United States is always going to be complicated and tough and variegated. And one thing that leads me to is this idea of what can you build in the capacity in a distributed way in communities so that they have their own connectedness. They know where to get information from. They know how to be adaptive. How important is that? They know when you hear the word pandemic, that it means that social distancing makes sense. So, you're kind of like normalizing that we're going to get it wrong.
I think we could do a lot better job. I mean, over the last decade or so, we have starved public health. So I was not a public health expert or familiar with it when I joined the Department of Homeland Security. I'd been a former judge, though, so I was used to being handed problems that I wasn't the expert in, but had to understand what were the vulnerabilities. And one thing that was very clear is that our state and local public health system is weak, and we have weakened it in recent years, and that is now showing. We just haven't invested. So I think if you have leadership at the federal government level, supporting state and locals financially, but also with research, best practices, information, sample messaging, you can have a much stronger response than we had here. We just simply didn't have that fully in place to support in the way that I think a federal system could work the best. Same is true in climate change. We are leaving communities up to their own devices to figure out, essentially reinvent the wheel and hoping for the best. But we certainly have a lot of knowledge that could be shared to make this a lot easier on people and have better results, in my opinion.
And I would add, I mean, those are really outstanding comments by Alice. I would also just reassert that surprise is inevitable, and it becomes imperative on federal governments and state governments to do everything possible to incorporate surprise into their planning process.
Right.
And this goes back to this comment that we both had before, is that U.S. decision making is almost entirely reactive, and it does very little to try to shape the future that we want. We also want to put out there that pandemic preparedness, pandemics and climate change and some other issues are examples of a term that I've heard recently called not black swans, but black elephants.
Right. I actually turned that into a meme a couple of years ago.
Yeah. So
they're so damn obvious.
Well, yeah, it's a combination of a black swan event and the elephant in the room, and problems that everyone knows about, but no one wants to deal with, and basically gambling that it's not going to, a black elephant isn't going to occur on someone's watch. And this tendency for policymakers, I would say Alice is a great exception to this rule, but to avoid the future is very, very persistent and not new. And so we need to build in processes and structures to offset this tendency to avoid the future. And the U.S. has lost quite a bit of its capability for strategic planning. And Alice mentioned Eisenhower a little bit ago. I think we would do a lot of good to look back to the Eisenhower administration's planning board that they had, that really beefed up strategic planning inside the U.S. government. It has deteriorated significantly in the last couple decades.
There was a question that came in that's worth posting here. Sorry, it's temporarily blocking your face, Alice. Scott Carlson says, from my story in 2011, following the recession, for those viewers interested, Patrick Doherty, a national security expert at the New America Foundation, and his colleagues believe that the nation needs grand strategy once again to meet a new global challenge. We think that the core global challenge is global unsustainability, he says, a convergence of major problems, including a persistent middle-class recession, ecological systems in decline, vast population of the world's poorest, etc. That's also, we had a conversation here with Puck Mickleby, who was one of the authors for the Joint Chiefs, who did this Mr. Y manifesto that made this same point, that a new narrative in which, as you were saying, the complexity of our global system now guarantees surprises, which guarantees to me the need for adaptive capacity, for agility, and Puck said in the Marines, he said that when you were given an order, you were also given a purpose, meaning it wasn't just go shoot the guy. It was there was some context, which I thought was interesting. I have a nephew who's in the Marines, but I did not serve, and that struck me as interesting because that gives permission for agility, for innovation, so it's not just do the thing. And I guess that feels to me like part of what would be a good policy or a trait to nurture in this environment. Alice, do you have thoughts?
Well, I think that historically we've seen nations have responded with great change after a calamity, whether it's a natural hazard or a pandemic. I'm sure there'll be far greater preparedness, at least in the coming decades, for biological threats as a result of this most recent challenge. I think that what's difficult is that, in my experience in government, it's still incremental, except for that area that needs to be fixed. And so we need clearly to fix the problem that allowed the country to be so vulnerable to a pandemic, and not have in place the proper protective equipment and understanding of what measures needed to be done quickly, as well as diagnostics. But I fear that just the nature of how business is done to get to a grand strategy doesn't feel, based on my experience in working in government, and I've spent almost all my career, likely to occur. It's in most areas, progress is made incrementally, and even with a pandemic to alert us to how serious this is, I anticipate that we may not make much progress, certainly in cutting emissions going forward with climate change. And we may also be very challenged in building resilience to the impacts that are already coming. So I love the idea of a grand strategy, but it seems a big stretch from my life experience. I hope I'm wrong.
Well, and at the same time, though, I guess the question is, if this doesn't spur it, what will? Deborah Brosnan, who was on here recently in 2015, co-authored for the European Science Foundation, I think that's it, European Science, a big report on geohazards and the need for much more international integration, coordination, planning. So you have the capacity, when we do identify an asteroid that is going to strike the Indian Ocean and create a tsunami that makes the 2004 tsunami look like a cakewalk, we have some sense of how to handle that. And it could be even years, it could be a 2-year advance notice, given astronomy, or pick your threat, Tambora scale eruption. They cited that the Iceland volcano that erupted less than a decade ago was a huge jolt to economics because of the shutdown of flights and stuff. And yet there too, you have this sense of, it's all good. And here we are with a pandemic where China wasn't actually being very clear in the early stages with some information that it could have shared, that Laurie Garrett reported on, who was on the show as well. So, okay, so backing up and saying, so as you just said, Alice, you don't have a lot of confidence. We can think and act grandly. What's the next best thing?
Incrementalism. Trying to push as many policies as we can to get the best results we can. And I think that takes individual leaders like Rod and others in their departments to step forward and say, we got to look at this. It just would, I think that's the only choice we have. And there's so much that can be done on a really across the board in any community to better prepare. We know that social capital is key, so we can start there.
Yeah, so, I want to show a visual here. And Rod, then in 2009, I spent time in Istanbul doing a story for the New York Times on the next great earthquake there. It's not a question of if, it's when, it's soon. 1999, they had the sort of the precursor quake. And I was so fascinated. I was in a poor neighborhood with a Swiss nonprofit group that had been training community teams to be ready to respond to when this quake happens. There are literally like 100 different teams across Istanbul, which essentially will become 100 tiny cities instead of being a mega city when the quake hits, because there won't be firefighting and all that. So, and the team that I met with, someone had mentioned that they're waiting for the quake, but they had responded to a terrorist bombing. There was a bomb that took down a building, and they had the capacity to respond. It was like, that struck me as really interesting. And I've seen, on Monday this week, I was talking here with a team of citizens in Bhopal who had formed around to be a coalition to reduce plastic trash in Bhopal. And now they're cooking and distributing food. And the same thing with using WhatsApp as the indicator of where the food need is, which slum. And this even came up with Occupy Wall Street became Occupy Sandy.
Mm-hmm.
So what systems, are there systems, or is there merit in just boosting the capacity for those kinds of adaptive qualities to expand and the like? Is that part of what we can think about? And I didn't mean to interrupt your train of thought, Rod. So if you want to just go back to what you were going to say.
Well, let me just, because I think Alice can talk to resilience and adaptive capacity quite well. There are many gains that happen when you build resilience. If you do it right, it's multi-purpose. And so that seems to me to be exactly right. But one of the things I want to make a plug for grand strategy, because I think Alice is quite correct that that day to day, month to month, it is incremental, but change is more than just speed; it's also direction, and so you need velocity. Someone may challenge my physics degree if I don't get that right, but basically, you need to change, but you need to also go in the right direction. And I think that there needs to be people in every agency, and also in the nucleus of the White House, who and pretty well staffed, who think and design a grand strategy. And I think one of the things that the Trump administration did right in the first year, and I saw these people work. I worked with them for almost a year. Is that they went to work on a national security strategy from the beginning, and held many meetings trying to formulate what kind of national security strategy this administration was going to pursue. Unfortunately, we went through 4 different national security advisors, so that kind of sabotages the continuity. But at least that's something that, that's some strategic thinking and shaping the future that I think the next administration would be very wise to emulate.
Why wasn't that? What was that also underway earlier, or was this a new? What was it about government and that aspects of government that made that a new and novel thing in the early days there?
So, I've only served under 2 administrations, so my statistics are not great here. But what was new is that they went to work on it right away, and it was issued. So the staff came in January, and it was overseen by a very highly skilled deputy national security advisor, and then issued in October, which is really fast comparatively to other administrations. So, there was a lot of deep thinking involved in that national security strategy. I would quibble with the contents, but it was a serious endeavor. But as I said, it's fairly detached from what the administration's actions have been. But that exercise, I think, is something to emulate in the future.
So quickly before, hold your thought. Yeah, Alice, yeah.
Jump in on the national security strategy. I agree.
Yeah.
Trump administration came out very quickly, but there was one very important omission, which has come at a great cost to the United States.
Right.
That document essentially does not talk about climate change.
That's right. Absolutely.
So that was a signal. There is no leadership in this space. We're not going to do a thing about it, and gave cover to people who didn't want to do anything about it because it wasn't even in there.
That's right.
I think that's exactly one of the dangers of global strategies. They can be manipulated to cost at a great cost to the nation because, of course, now we're not doing anything on climate change. We're rolling back everything, which will come to haunt us in future years. So I think, Andy, your point, with incrementalism, you get all hazards. So you got to have seismic, you got to have bio threats, climate, terrorism, nuclear, but you also need a whole of community because ultimately these responses will require leaders at all levels to be involved in the long term.
Yeah, that's well, and let's circle back to that question about leaving out climate change. I'd have to look back at what emerged, but if it did talk about energy security and vulnerability, for example, and just didn't talk about the Paris Agreement, would that be enough to fight it? I'm thinking about this the way, this is different than how the legislature works, Congress. But it's like, can you build enough of a head of steam on something internally, knowing that it's imperfect or even deeply flawed, but it's going in the right direction? Or I don't know how this works out. Again, most of my brain in thinking about these things, thinking about government, is about legislation and how Congress is always horse trading, and how like Obama's climate bill got rejected in part because it didn't have nuclear in it, and some of the enviros, there was McCain when they added nuclear to a climate bill, and the climate community kind of pulled back from supporting it because they didn't want nuclear. Yeah, I don't know, within these processes, grand strategy, a new direction for government and thinking about big risks, is it okay to know that some of it will be torqued or not? I don't know.
Well, I think with the national security strategy, President Obama had been very forward-leaning in his strategy, stating that climate change was a public health risk, risk to our national security, and economic risk. And then you have a new administration coming in, really just not mentioning it. I think it's vulnerable. Perhaps if we had it in legislation, it'd be less vulnerable. But getting agreement through our Congress as to what that should encompass seems very difficult, at least right now, given our polarization.
Yeah.
And let me mention that, I, as an advocate of formulating and thinking about a grand strategy, it's of course not sufficient on its own. As Alice correctly says, it's once you write it, it's static and gives cover to other elements. But if you do it right, and again, it's ultimately good leadership at the top matters. It's incredibly important. But you also have to have some element within the government. Again, my time in government has been in the executive branch, but you need an element that is strategic in focus, but also working on issues going forward. So what does this policy mean 5, 10, 20 years from now? What does this operation in North Africa mean, 10 years from now, right? So it's none of that can be written down in a grand strategy, but you still have to build that adaptive capacity, in a policy way inside of the government, and states can do this as well.
There was a question that came in a minute ago, circling back to scenarios and working out gaming things out and coming to conclusions. knowing how flawed we are at some of these timescales and uncertainty questions. And it's about AI. Owen Reese asks, ask about AI, can it help? In other words, like Arizona State has this decision theater. I've talked a lot with Michael Crow about that over the years, where there's systems, we can start to understand how the human system, not just our behavioral, our perception system, but how human systems, decision systems work or don't work. Is there a kind of a dashboard that can be created that has a little yellow light glowing when an issue like pandemic risk has certain characteristics that we know we're going to get wrong without a nudge from some external intelligence? Does that make sense at all? You know what I'm saying? Like Dan Kahneman, I'll just give you an example. Dan Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for his behavioral science on risk misperception and wrote that great book, Thinking Fast and Slow. On last Saturday, he was on the New Yorker Radio Hour being interviewed, and he said he got this totally wrong in his own head. He said, he knows more about exponential growth and risk and how it is perceived than anyone. And he said he was still like on the borderline of flying to France like 4 weeks ago. And
right.
and the reason he didn't go wasn't rational. It was like some, toss of the dice kind of thing related to cost or whatever. Do we need help? Like, can technology help us here?
Well, absolutely. And so, just there are several classes of surprises, right? There's the tactical type of surprise that the military thinks about, and there's the system shocks that we're going through right now, and then there are like the tectonic type shifts of like the rise of China that takes place over a longer period. And in that middle category, I think is where machine learning, near AI capabilities can really be helpful in seeing patterns before our human brain can see them. And so the intelligence community spends quite a bit of time and quite a bit of resources in strategic foresight. For example, one element of this is trying to see emergent technologies and emergent subfields of science, even before the practitioners know that this is a community building, and they scan the gray literature and the open literature and pick up these trends using machine learning, using AI. And that's just one example, but in terms of strategic foresight, I think it's going to be incredibly important going forward, especially as the algorithms become more sophisticated.
Yeah, it feels, and even I could think of on that more granular scale, how we've heard recently how ventilators that were theoretically in stockpiles hadn't been tested in a year because someone forgot to whatever, and having the same kind of nudgy apps that we use to say you haven't gone for a walk in 2 hours. Feels like there's a lot more capacity there at a much more actionable sort of granular level too, to have the system designed better to nudge us toward preparedness. Alice, on that preparedness side, when you look around what's been unfolding, it must be, I don't know what the feelings must be like, knowing what you wrote a book recently about some of this too, and a colleague of ours here at the Earth Institute Jeff Schlegelmilch has a book coming out on readiness. So obviously you can't wind the clock back and say, let's do it this way, but right where you are now, what is the top of the list of the things you think about when you say, wow, here's what we can definitely do way better given what's unfolded so far?
If you look back in history, it's a failure of imagination. It's Daniel Kahneman that we just can't really get our heads around these events. So there'll be a commission, there'll be some investigation after this pandemic, and I'm very confident that one of the conclusions will be that we failed to imagine how bad this could be. Just as that was the conclusion, that was the biggest failure after 9/11. That's
Sure.
what the commission said. It's what they said after Pearl Harbor. It's essentially what was said after Katrina. So we know that we have these failures of imagination. They're just part of how we get through life, is that we don't imagine how bad this could possibly be. So then we get back, we just need to systematize it. I think your recommendation about it being informed by AI, and I think AI, the Internet of Things, the sensors can inform us about vulnerabilities in a way that we've never had before. You've seen that with the temperatures. They can tell you where it's spiking now with the thermometers. And it will take a while, but the government, as well as businesses, private sector, need to incorporate these signals and then really systematize their decision making so that they can imagine this. Unfortunately, I don't think in many boardrooms across the United States, as they were watching the news from China, companies were thinking about how are we going to deal with our employees working remotely. I don't think they had invested in the technology. Zoom, I understand, has greatly increased in value, but we need to force ourselves, impose the discipline to force ourselves to imagine the unimaginable so that we're not accused of a failure of imagination after every one of these events.
And I guess that gets back to the page 21 effect too. Then it comes back to how do you then have the imagination in the room, create the scenarios, and create actionable pathways out of them. I've been, since 2008, I've been posting this periodic mantra on when I was writing the blog. That came from a reader, actually, in 2008. It was, are we stuck with blah, 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 bang? You've probably heard me say this more than a few times. So I guess along with the imagination comes the imagination to action part, And one tool that that I know a lot of people have meant the loss of was the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment. Maybe we need a Congressional Office of Future Assessment or something along those lines. On .earth, also a decade ago, a lawyer in Vermont, at Vermont Law School, I think, Raffensperger, she proposed the future needs a legal guardian. For just another example of enforcing us to really think about the future, which is what everything we've just been talking about is about, right? It's about future possibilities. But nudging us to actually raise the profile of that in our actual decisions, in our budgets, in maybe breaking some old narratives and path dependencies, and how you invest. Just as you were saying, investing in strategic planning, making that a core part of the Defense Department's thinking. Internationally, here also 2 weeks ago, Laurie Garrett, who's written on pandemic risk since AIDS,
right?
She did a piece in The Lancet on the gross underinvestment in communication capacity, meaning the World Health Organization has like 2 people who monitor social media around, and when we know the infodemic around the pandemic is hugely consequential.
Right.
So that I guess that means that leads to a huge list of to-do things, but they all have the same property, which is getting the future into the room in a more meaningful way.
Right. And, it comes back to this, this issue of flying blind into the future, right? We know it's hard. We know there are going to be mistakes. You can't predict the future, but what you can do is reduce uncertainty. We can do that. We can do it with technology. We can do it with just good old analysis and brain power. Bring in experts. Think about how trends converge, how the international system is changing right before our eyes, how the United States is a variable in many of these trends. And we need to address this systematically. I think having Congress do it makes a lot of sense. By the way, this worldwide threat assessment that we kicked off this episode with is in response to Congress asking for a yearly update of the threats facing the United States. So it's kind of built in to the system that we're only going to look at tactical short-term concerns. Where is the hearing on long-term strategic threats. So I used to write a lot of the language in that worldwide threat assessment. And it was a self-limiting factor, like, oh, which element of climate change, which element of pandemic risk is going to arise in a 12-month window? It's an artificial exercise, and we squeeze it in. But it's a longer-term strategic risk that again, just whole parts of our government are not asking those questions or prepared to answer them.
It's pretty clear that the current administration is only focused on tactical,
transactional,
and political, mostly strategic questions. Alice?
One way possibly to force a greater focus on these future risks is establishing some kind of accountability system for our politicians. There's this expression, NIMT, not in my term. And we certainly see that the immediate gets the focus of politicians, the potholes, getting the schools money, fighting crime. But if we had some measure for politicians and their success, including asking them during debates and otherwise, what would be your plans to prepare the United States for these strategic long-term risks? I think it would be quite informative. When we talk about climate change, it's mostly about cutting emissions, which is very, very important. But we already have impacts that we know will be coming in the next decades that will be worsened and will really be very difficult for communities to deal with. And there isn't a lot of discussion about what we're going to do to that, how we'll fund for that, and how we'll keep communities healthy and help them move away from risk. We need to start insisting that our politicians have plans for this. And maybe we can use the pandemic as an example of why we need to really dig deep into what their thoughts are on preparedness.
I couldn't agree more. Well, I think you and I are on the same train there for sure. There's so much lack of focus on what you really need to invest in to boost resilience at the community level. And at Columbia, we did a meeting right after I started on managed retreat. There's another one planned next year. And to me, part of the big question is, what do we name this other than managed retreat? Because even those words are very flawed and
charged.
Thinking about, so adaptive communities, adaptive coasts. There's ways anyway, Rod?
So one of the things I wanted to hop on, a question and a thread that you posed earlier, and that has to do with information. And I think anytime we start thinking about strategic planning, we have to think about information, really misinformation and disinformation. We need to think about it as using the concepts and language of risk assessment and threat assessment. We've always had propaganda and misinformation, but it hasn't really impacted our societies and our decision makers the way it is now. I mean, my friends still in the intelligence community tell me that they spend so much time chasing down conspiracy theories and misinformation that it gets in the way of their actual day-to-day job. I mean, I think it's a critical piece that you keep bringing up, information quality, and I think it's something that we need to study analytically.
Yeah, and that's why I created this initiative at Columbia. I'm really glad Alex Halliday, the director, liked the idea. To me, the simplest way to think of what we're facing is that Earth has a new system. There's the Earth systems. We always talk about Earth system science.
Right.
The information system as it exists now is fundamentally different than what we had 20 years ago. And technology for communication has always changed the world. The passenger pigeon partially went extinct because of the telegraph, where they used to send telegrams saying the pigeons have landed in the Midwest, and people would get on trains from the East Coast and come to shoot them. But that was in the 1800s. That was the same technology that also facilitated weather forecasting. Real-time data transmission from different places to London. You could start to forecast the weather. And I think still now we don't really I don't think the world has fully grasped how profound a change in the Earth system we now are experiencing. And, it's a human system, but it changes everything. It changes the capacity to know, without asking China, how much coal they're using in their coal-fired power plants. Now satellite imagery shows that. And it used to be all CIA, and now it's everybody through my friends at planet.com and everywhere else.
Right.
Alice and Rod, do you think, what's your sense of how important that would be in considering how to get these risks a little less wrong going forward?
Information?
Yeah, like being clear about that we don't understand it. This is like, I don't think anyone predicted. There was a lot of worry about Trump and Twitter right at the beginning. Jay Rosen at NYU.
Right.
But I still, the media still hasn't figured out how to deal with that. It was like,
right.
Talk about a shock to the system that no one could figure out. And so I don't know, is this adequately being dug in on?
No, it is not at all. I mean, we're just we're at the very initial stages of really understanding this. I think we really need to bring different elements of the scientific community in, the psychologists, the neurobiologists, as well as good old-fashioned communications experts to really understand the changes that are happening in the information sphere. I agree with you that this can be thought of as an emerging system or an expanding system of the Earth system, but it has, just in the policy space, it has blocked misinformation, and really disinformation turning into misinformation, has blocked meaningful progress on a number of policy concerns, especially the climate change issue. It is the primary reason why we are 25 years behind where we should be.
Yeah, information misuse or.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's all an information exercise.
Yeah.
Well, I would add that I think over time, as I've worked on these catastrophic risks, I have concluded that the human brain is very challenged in properly assessing these risks. It's a lot to do with the behavioral scientist Daniel Kahneman's work. Our biases get in the way. Availability bias, if we haven't experienced it, like a pandemic, we tend to underestimate it. Optimism bias, it won't happen to us. America will somehow be spared from COVID-19. We need to better understand how we can work around those, because we think we're rational, but if you look back, our responses often are over responses because we have the availability bias. So we're just, after 9/11, it was all anti-terrorism, which meant that other issues didn't get some of the attention that we now realize they needed to get. And probably the same will happen here. So we need to bring in those experts to help us improve our decision making so that it is really more comprehensive and reflects the true nature of the risk rather than how our brains tell us those risks seem to appear.
So there's a comment that came in that's going to be interesting for you to look at and think about. This Yanni, he's kind of a curmudgeon. He says Trump's shock to the system is constructive and dialectical. It's better than idolized, fascistic fake news media outlets and their entrenched elite audience. Now, that's kind of a cartoonish and provocative way to frame something that I do think is worth talking about, which is, can we take away from the experience that's been unfolding here lessons going forward? Is this shock to the system? It's not just the virus, it's, as I said, the infodemic around the pandemic, what this has revealed about the press's relationship to the presidency, et cetera. What is there an opportunity here?
Well, I think this event and the way it's unfolded has revealed a number of things. Leadership matters, and the ability to communicate accurately matters. And when we have no strategy in place or not an exercise strategy, it makes us vulnerable. So I would disagree with this is a fake news problem. I think it's shown that the federal government in particular should be in a position to assist the states and local governments to deal with things on the ground. And this has shown that without the proper emphasis on leadership and preparedness, it has not been able to do that in the way that the nation needed it to do.
Yeah, and I would be rather interested in hearing the longer argument of how the shock to the system is constructive, especially now. That does not seem to be logical. I do think some shifts are good for the system. Undermining credibility of fact-pursuing organizations and posing alternative narratives that aren't based in evidence, but are based in anecdote or even wishful thinking, I think is only corrosive to decision-making at all levels. And I would say, and this is me as a scientist speaking, I think it's immoral to be engaged in telling lies in a moment of crisis. And
I guess the part of that resonated to a certain extent for me is the role of the press for the time being, and actually for the last 3 years, and even exacerbated in the recent days with Trump's press conferences, which are designed to occupy space, give him a platform. The press plays along with this over and over again. Jay Rosen at NYU is a longtime media analyst and critic, and he said the press needs to go into emergency mode. That right now it's clear that simply turning on the live stream from the White House, as has been happening, has been doing exactly what Rod has mentioned, is spreading these false assertions, and then the media does this kind of silly, ridiculous, nonstop fact checking, which psychologists say actually doesn't actually change people's attitudes in many cases. That if you're a Trumpian, it just makes you feel more loyal to the guy because he's being assailed. And there are different strategies. In other words, the media can choose or not choose to broadcast live the pandemic briefings, at least, and focus on the actual sources of information. CDC, NIH, and like. It feels like there's a trap here that no one has figured out how to get out of yet.
Yeah. Well, what I would say is, press and communications are outside of my expertise. I do think it's incorrect to call the media, to use that as a monolithic term, because there are many different types of outlets there in terms of whether they're evidence-based or not. But I do think, again, just going back to being a scientist, and Alice's, remarks earlier about, the way our own neurology and our own cognitive system doesn't always lead us down the right path. Well, this is why we invented science hundreds of years ago, right?
Right.
To expand past the limitations of ourselves. And so
like microscope and telescope.
Microscope, telescope, and really those are the instruments of science, but also the method of science is to, it's there so that we could move past what Carl Sagan called was the demon haunted world. And there are still truths and non-truths, and engaging in non-truths, seems to not serve the public interest.
Yeah. So we're circling back one more time to the question, the page 121 question. So could you imagine, do this scenario exercise? of imagining what a process would look like, having been in that process, literally,
Sure.
where a virus emerging in Wuhan
Right.
gets detected and how that plays out.
Well, I mean, the first thing that you would do, I mean, what you hope to have is a team inside the government whose only task is to look for that, right? Because we know it's coming. This won't be the last pandemic. There are really good articles and a lot of good scientists who are arguing that climate change will be bringing more emerging infectious diseases, because those pathogens are more able to evolutionarily adapt to new systems, leaving and hop hosts, leaving humans and other organisms as victims. But here's the deal: you use science. Let science lead. And as soon as we learned the code, the genetic code of parts of the coronavirus, which we knew in early January, that's when that pandemic response team, and Alice knew them. I knew them quite well. What they would do is contact the agency, the elements inside the government, international elements who test. Testing is a fundamental pillar of tackling a pandemic, like this one or the next one. And it's incomprehensible to me how far back we were in getting tests. It's a national disgrace.
Right.
And so, but that's the first thing you do, because if you don't understand the problem, you can't work to combat the problem.
So a more meaningful and listened to structure within government to be the agile observer, tracker, reporter on emergent situations that have the characteristic of being big disruptors. It seems like that's where there has to be a thing. And I guess, well, that was what, at least the news from ABC this week was that military medical intelligence information didn't get there.
National Center for Medical Intelligence. I knew these folks very well. They're part of the Defense Intelligence Agency. I think they're 85 to 100% either physicians or infectious disease experts or environmental health experts. I think quite highly of them. I have a little bit of skepticism that they broke this story in November. That sounds a little bit playing loose. I'd like to know more about that. But I know, just because I'm very familiar with the organizations, and my own experience watching the Ebola outbreak occur, and the intelligence community and other parts of the national security community being on it well before it was public. I have no doubt that elements in the intelligence community were on this, in late December, early January.
Yeah, and I'm just posting. ABC did get later. They got some pushback from Colonel Shane Day on that, saying that there was no such NCMI product. Now, obviously, that you can write a denial like that. That could be different.
Right.
Can be, true and false or whatever. I kind of sense to you, though, this gets back to the page 121 effect. Even if that intelligence group had stated in some technical way that there was this hotspot emerging, I still don't sense that the system is set up well for that information to become actionable.
Well, we're getting, right now, just looking at, the text that you're putting up, is when something that is a strategic foresight exercise starts to become tactical. And then that's where the government does have quite a bit of capability to play, as long as it's done some planning ahead of time. The worst place you want to be in a rapidly evolving complex emergency is you don't want to be blind. You want to have thought through this ahead of time. And the thing is, I sat through dozens of pandemic preparedness exercises over a decade. I'm sure Alice did the same. It's just thinking about which elements get moved into action. There's so many moving parts. I find it shocking that with all of that capacity, there are still some key elements just completely inoperable, it seems.
Yeah. Well, Alice, with on that question, when you had to drop off, we were talking about what would the system look like that gets this right or less wrong. We circle back to that question of where do we go from here, and maybe using this as a case study. Obviously, you haven't been in the loop on this particular internal threat assessment, but suppose that this particular NCMI had come out with some strong sign that there was a disruptive disease outbreak in that part of China. How do we think about creating the pipeline? It might even not be the right architecture to get that where it needs to go in ways that kind of get the right response. And maybe it is what Rod said. Maybe it's not the response. It's the preparation for the response. It's like, as he said, so you know what to do when that signal comes through. Is there something like that you could propose an architecture for next week that could take us in a better direction?
Well, I think it requires leadership, and it requires some entity or some body being entrusted with the responsibility to watch for these threats and then inform early. The government did create, and I didn't research what kind of funding it has had since I left government, the National Biological Integration Center that's run by DHS, and its purpose was to take news reports and other reports of emerging infectious disease outbreaks, naturally occurring outbreaks of anthrax, you name it, and then prepare classified and unclassified information for agencies, both state and local, to consume and do their proper planning. If such an entity were empowered and could serve as the early warning and then properly go up to the chain so that someone actually does act, I think we can do it. This isn't rocket science. It requires coordination. It requires empowerment of those on the ground to inform leaders to act. And what we had here is news emerging, and then we're not getting the diagnostics ready. We're not getting the testing done. We're not opening up the national stockpiles. At least that's not being made aware to the United States to double check where we are. We're not negotiating through the federal government to help the state and locals with the shortage of supplies. We're leaving them on their own. There were many choices that could have been made differently if we had simply treated it with the seriousness that it deserves. So I don't think we need new systems. We need better coordination and assertion of leadership, and then empowerment of people to act.
A reasonable assessment. I think we're close to being able to wrap up here. I wanted you both to kind of go at this one last time in the sense of if there's a convening that could happen, and obviously one thing I always try to stress in these sustain what conversations is right now we're still in the now phase. There's so much about the now that can on a daily basis mitigate or exacerbate outcomes in every village, town around the world. And it's wonderful. It's important to honor the folks who are on the front lines right now doing in that decision space, whether it's individual risk of someone's restocking grocery store shelves or these people in Bhopal, India, who created a chain to get food. There's a guy there, he's an accountant who wakes up at 7 a.m, starts driving food and doesn't stop till 1:30 a.m, answering these WhatsApp calls. They're all heroes of the moment. At the same time, as Congress releases money, as people who are in positions of responsibility take this moment to look ahead, that's why it's legitimate and important to have this discussion as well, to make sure that we're not just going to build back, to make sure we're testing ways to avoid path dependency, and that's happening. It's happening in academia. You know, anyone who thinks that Zoom is a patchwork thing we're doing temporarily, and then we're all going to go back to a system where students are going into deep debt to go to a college to learn. Anyone who thinks that we're going back to that system is fantasizing. Some of it will be there. So anyway, so where do we go from here part? If you could just each articulate a little bit of a vision statement, that would be great.
Well, I will go back to a call for strategic planning, and we are blessed with the tools to do more strategic foresight than ever. We understand at least the known risks better than we ever have. We know, for example, a range of trajectories with respect to warming of the planet. We know trajectories of, how our ecological systems are heading. We don't understand a lot of the convergences. But we really need to build on this strategic foresight capabilities in a way that brings us back from dealing with crises, constant crises. Again, I go back to that statement. If all you do is crisis management, that's all you will ever do. And plan out the future, shape the future, expect surprise, and build this in many levels, not just the federal government, states, cities. It is a recipe for disaster, because the profile of risks and threats and surprises that are coming over the next 10, 20, 30 years is unprecedented.
Alice, what's your way to wrap things up?
Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Rod. But I think there's another aspect that I would like to add. We need the strategic planning and foresight. I'm reminded of a story that Thad Allen told about when he was, Michael Brown was removed from FEMA for the response to Katrina. He was put in charge. He was the commandant of the Coast Guard. And he describes his first meeting with the first responders, and they said, someone asked, well, what should we be doing? And Thad Allen didn't say, well, you should follow these regulations. You should make sure you have this in your boat or whatever you're doing. He said, treat everyone as if they're your family. And I think we need to treat these risks as if it could affect ourselves or our families. We somehow think it's not us. And this pandemic, if it's proven anything, it affects everyone. No matter if you're better off and more privileged and still being paid, you're still at home, or for those most vulnerable who are suffering far more. But it's affecting everyone. And we have to start thinking that way instead of thinking this is some distant problem that optimistically it won't be our problem. And that requires us to have the courage to actually look at these issues and come up with some ideas and approaches for having better outcomes.
I think this is really valuable coda here. David Van Bema, who's a journalist I went to journalism school with at Columbia in 1981, 82, has been watching today and offered some good comments. He says, as Karen Russell wrote in the New Yorker, flatten the curve has been incredibly helpful and empowering. I'd be fascinated to see graphs that might be important for 4 or 5 different potential crises, not for immediate action, for a sense of where we are. There was a great cartoon in the New Yorker. Gosh, if you give me a second here, I could show everyone, because I showed it yesterday, that got the curve of the flat curve for this outbreak in the context of the climate curve,
right?
Which is this grand, larger cresting wave. And I guess I do think there's a role here. This gets to the imagination part that you both have mentioned for communication innovation as well. There have been some great innovative approaches here that many of which actually came from the bottom up. I will offer one final thought. I should really show you this though. I gotta find it.
Yeah, so let me jump on David's remark because it's quite important. The fact that social distancing has thus far worked fantastically, although this is a developing crisis, is exactly what we're talking about. Not watch the future evolve, but shape it. Shape it with today's action. And so, but you have to understand enough of, right? Flattening the curve would not have been possible if we hadn't done a lot of, epidemiology well in advance. We know through science and policy what works, and shaping the future through current actions, and not allowing these efforts to be recategorized as misinformation, as, oh, the experts were wrong about the projections, right? There's a big danger of it being recharacterized as a failure of the scientific and medical experts. What we're seeing is that we had a big role in how this developed. Again, I'm down in Western North Carolina, where we're behind the rest of the curve right now. It still hasn't really crested, in this part of the country. So I'm very hesitant to be talking about this in any past tense.
So I zoomed in on this cartoon purposely. I want you to see. This was actually on Instagram. It wasn't in the New Yorker. I'll be happy when this is over. They're looking at the familiar curve of the virus, but here's the big curve. And to me, that big curve is not just climate change; it's the Anthropocene. It's the extinction crisis. It's our impacts on the oceans, and the perceptual challenge in getting, as you both said, getting the future in the room in a way that's actionable, and also uncertainty. We don't know how fast sea level is going to rise. We still don't know. Science has determined, one of the things we know most powerfully about climate change is that we don't know how fast sea levels are going to rise between now and 2100. And but
we bounded it.
But we bounded it at between manageable and catastrophe. And so that's why decision making under deep uncertainty, the deepuncertainty.org, the folks like Rob Lempert, who were on this show recently, part of what science reveals is sometimes that we don't know. And then that throws the responsibility back on us on how to deal with actions when we don't know the full scope of the outcomes as well. So science, it can reduce the uncertainty, but often more science has created more complexity. And that's another part of the challenge going forward too. It's like you can't tell me, neither of you can tell me that AR 6 or 7 or 8, the IPCC reports coming, is going to change the curve of understanding of sea level rise in time to be meaningful for policy. Unless I would put money on that there won't be some magical study that says, oh, now we know it's going to be 2.5 feet by 2100.
But when you're doing risk assessment, you should over prepare than under prepare, right? I mean,
but here's and this is where it gets so complex. I want to do a separate show on this. How many hospital beds is enough? Like in Japan, it's 12.8 hospital beds per 1,000 people. In the United States, it's 2.8. And we know that 2.8 doesn't capture surges, right? And there's separate statistics for ICU beds, and it's terrible. So there are these value judgments, how many people in Japan are older? What is the characteristics of countries that lead to different decision-making? Korea, I haven't seen, maybe you guys know, I haven't seen yet an assessment of how South Korea's really good response was a function of the fact that they're basically on a war footing all the time. South Korea has a really good medical preparedness because, they're sitting a dozen miles from doom. And how much of that is, it's easy for us to say, oh, wow, South Korea got it right and we got it wrong. But how much of that's sort of cultural, political priorities that are really different? Seems that these lead to still some interesting questions.
Well, one thing I would add is because there is so much uncertainty, that means that we need to plan for the uncertainty in the choices we make. So we need to have in the back of our minds, if we needed to surge with this building structure, whatever, be able to surge in time. And that goes for a bridge. You can build the bridge so that it is at a static level, or you can build it so it could be easily raised if the sea level rise continues at far less expense. So it's taking into account the uncertainty now, knowing that we won't get it perfect, but we might have a better outcome if we've at least thought about how we could expand or contract as circumstances demand.
And I would just put back in, in the sea level rise example, and I make this point, when I teach this to my students, the modeling captures mostly, if not entirely, known processes, right? That, in terms of warming and the interaction with the cryosphere. We should also note the climate that sea level rise looks to be accelerating after a linear, trend for most of the last 30, 40 years. But those models don't capture a lot of possible, maybe probable as we go further in time, physical processes that will exacerbate sea level rise. And so, the Mike Mann from Penn State often says, uncertainty is not our friend with respect to climate change. And, I think, we can't continue doing, casino type policy making and decision making, just hoping that we roll the snake eyes or hoping that we roll the double sixes, right? Which has kind of been our approach. We're hoping that things aren't as bad as the scientists are telling us. That's a terrible way to do policy. And so in terms of sea level rise, if you had to bet, you would probably bet that it's going to be worse than predicted, than better than predicted. So back to the risk assessment.
Yep. Well, I'm hoping that these discussions we're having here can lead us into a better place. They spill into academia, they spill into policy. Tomorrow on Sunday, we swing into the arts. I'm determined that this program is about all the responses at various levels we need to take or consider to have a smoother ride through both the now of this thing, this tragedy, and the next. And it's been great having both of you on now twice.
Thank
and
you.
I hope we can deepen this further. Iterative discussions can lead to outcomes that are better than just one-off talking head moments. And I think that's what I'm trying to build here is trajectory toward not just understanding, but outcome. And I thank you both for being part of this.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
And we'll do more. So Sunday, Dar Williams, the songwriter, is going to be with us. And an artist named Emil Alzamora is going to take us on a studio tour virtually. You think about all these realms of the arts that are paralyzed utterly by where we're at. People there are being creative and collective also in ways that are extraordinary and interesting. And then back into the maw next week. I'm going to have on, let's see here, Thomas Puyo, who is out in Silicon Valley. He's the one who wrote a very influential piece on Medium about the transition in strategy around COVID-19 from the hammer to the dance. It's a paper about The next stage, once you've done the lockdown, is more of a, as you were saying, testing. Wide testing has to be part of the future. And then sort of an agile dance. It's like stamping out the little fires that are going to pop up as the wind-borne firebrands extend. This is going to go into Africa and South America and then come back. And the dance is the next part of the equation. We've been enduring a pretty powerful hammer now. So thank you, Alice Hill.
Thank you.
Rod Schoonover. Stay safe. Hope those around you stay safe as well. And to everybody who tuned in today, please share this. It gets archived. And it's our experiment at Columbia University's Earth Institute. This is a global conversation around, for now, focused on COVID-19, but very much focused on the systems and solutions that we need to build to have a smoother ride for humanity going into the rest of this wacky century. Whether you call it the Anthropocene or not, it's a time of deep uncertainty, incredible opportunity, and a lot of risk. So go forth and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Sustain What, a production of the Initiative on Communication and Sustainability at Columbia University's Climate School. If you like, send your feedback or ideas for future shows to j.mp/sustainwhatfeedback. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe and build a better world.